My name is Rafael Coda. I am the Program Manager for Quality and Patient Safety at ASHA, and I have the privilege to introduce our next speaker. And we might have recalled earlier that we mentioned the Health Equity Conference earlier, and participants from that requested resources and ultimately a sample policy and procedure to help guide care. And this is a perfect example of that. But as a result, ASHA engaged with Copplesmith-Brockelman to create a sample policy and procedure that meets regulatory requirements and has a practical application. So we are pleased to introduce Catherine Hyde, an accomplished attorney from the esteemed law firm of Copplesmith and Brockelman here in Phoenix, and she has a specialization in healthcare sector. She provides invaluable counsel, to not only patients but also consumer communications, ensuring adherence to both state and federal regulations. Her significant contribution to our cause has included co-authoring a new sample and equitable care for accessibility, and today she's here to join us. So thank you, Catherine. Please welcome her.
Hello, thank you for having me here today. So I'm here to talk about a sample policy that addresses accessibility for people with sensory disabilities. So that includes deaf, hard of hearing, blind, or deafblind people who may seek care in hospitals and healthcare settings. So the intent with this policy is to make it thorough enough to cover all of the legal requirements to comply with disability laws, while at the same time allowing particular facilities to tailor the procedures to work for your patient population and taking into consideration the resources that are available. So quick disclaimer that this information is for educational purposes and it's not legal advice. The stated purpose of the policy is a commitment to advancing health equity and compliance with disability laws. So the laws that we took a look at include federal laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, state laws like the Arizonans with Disabilities Act, as well as Joint Commission accreditation standards, and also web content accessibility guidelines for online accessibility. And we also looked at some enforcement actions that have taken place recently where the Office of Civil Rights has investigated healthcare providers to take a look at what accessibility is offered to people who are deaf and hard of hearing and whether that's meeting the legal requirements. And the legal standard is to ensure effective communications with patients and their companions so that they can have effective communication under the circumstances of their care. And that's going to vary person to person depending on the patient's condition or their usual communication methods. And so the policy has baked in factors that you can consider as you're making decisions about whether communication is effective or not and whether you need to provide a different aid or service, such as an in-person interpreter. So the policy is to provide all necessary auxiliary aids and services as soon as possible and without cost to the person being served. And as soon as possible will obviously depend on the circumstances. If your organization is in an urban area or a rural area, travel times may be different and there may be different resources available. But that is the legal standard that we need to aim for. So here's an overview of the topics that are in the procedure. First, there's an identification and assessment of need. And then we describe a number of different aids and services that may be available so that you can think about what is feasible to offer and what is going to be appropriate in different circumstances. We also covered documentation in the medical record, ongoing training and monitoring to make sure that once you have a procedure in place, that it's actually implemented. I'm also going to share a little bit about patient privacy concerns when you're sharing information that may be protected health information under HIPAA. with interpreters or with family members and friends who may be accompanying a patient. And I'm also going to talk about digital accessibility for online resources, and then suggestions for how to handle patient questions or complaints that may come up. So the first step that's really important is identification and assessment of need. You can provide notice of the availability of services through notices that are posted in waiting rooms or any kind of marketing that you may do through social media. And when an individual self-identifies as a person with a disability or requests an aid or service, the procedure is to consult with the individual to determine what aids or services are necessary to provide effective communication in particular situations. And the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing has a tool that is really useful in this situation. It's a short form that the patient can complete when they first arrive, and they can express their preferences. And if they have had a particular experience with a particular service in the past that hasn't worked for them, they can provide that information so that it can speed up a little bit the process of figuring out what is going to work for this person in these particular circumstances. And it's also important to document that individualized assessment in the medical record, both from a compliance standpoint and also to help other care providers who may be interacting with this particular patient in the future. So auxiliary aids and services refers to the communication tools or assistance required for people with sensory disabilities. And that's a legal standard that comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act. The policy includes factors to consider when determining what a particular aid or service is appropriate in the circumstances. For example, you need to take into account the physical setting where the patient is being treated, the condition that they are receiving treatment for, what their pain level is. If they're recovering from surgery, they may not have the same mobility that they would usually. And the plan is to tailor those procedures to fit the circumstances that may be presented. So there's a few pieces of information that it's important to document in the medical record. I spoke about the individualized assessment. It's also important to document what services were offered, what services were actually used, and if the patient refused to a particular service that was offered. That includes interpreters or communication aids or other electronic tools that are used. If there's any significant dialogue with the patient about those services, such as whether they're satisfied with the quality of the video remote interpreting, whether they're satisfied with the quality of the in-person interpreter, if there's any disagreements about whether something is effective or not effective, if the patient has any complaints, those are all things that should be documented in the medical record. And also document any measures that were taken to address any issues that came up, like technical issues or problems with the technology. So another important thing is training and monitoring, because you can draft a really wonderful procedure, but if it isn't implemented in practice, then it doesn't do very much good. So training on these procedures should include all workforce members, including security personnel or volunteers. It can be included as part of initial employee and volunteer orientations, and then it can also be included as part of ongoing monitoring to see whether there are new technologies that might be useful and what's working and what isn't working. Another important thing when implementing these procedures is to consider vendors, because from a compliance standpoint, you also need to make sure that vendors and subcontractors are complying with applicable licensing requirements. We already heard that the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing licenses interpreters, and that's required for all in-person interpreters or video remote interpreters. And if a patient is located in Arizona, but the interpreter is not located in Arizona and it's done remotely, that remote interpreter still needs to be licensed by the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So questions come up in this area related to patient privacy. If a healthcare provider is discussing protected health information under HIPAA, is that information that can be shared with an interpreter or with a patient's family member or friend or companion? And there are several circumstances where the information can be provided without a written authorization from the patient. First of all, if the interpreter works for the provider, or if the interpreter is acting on behalf of the provider but is not an employee, and there's a written contract with the interpreter that meets the HIPAA business associate contract requirements. For example, if there's an agency that contracts with the hospital, or if there's a community-based organization that provides interpretation services, there needs to be a business associate agreement in place. And finally, if the interpreter is a patient's family member or friend, health information can be shared as long as the patient agrees or does not object to that person hearing the health information. Generally, though, it's important to communicate directly with patients who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. Even if there are family members or friends present, they should generally be excluded from one-on-one conversations as they would be with a hearing patient, unless the patient does not object to their presence or has agreed that that companion is going to act as their interpreter. And if a patient is receiving healthcare services that are subject to more stringent privacy laws, then keep in mind that there might be other rules that apply in those circumstances. The procedure also covers digital accessibility, and this isn't required by law, but it is a best practice. And if your organization is not yet in compliance with the industry standards for web content accessibility, you can put together a plan to figure out where are the areas where we could make some easy improvements, where are the areas where it might take us a little bit longer, and put together a timeline for coming into compliance. It's also important to make sure that all vendors and subcontractors who might be handling web hosting and things like that are also addressing digital accessibility. The procedure also includes some best practices for communicating with people who are deaf and hard of hearing, guidelines for good language practices, best ways to talk about disabilities, and some suggestions for personal interactions to make it more likely that there's going to be effective communication. One other thing that can be helpful for implementation is to designate certain staff members or roles who have responsibility for training or implementing the procedure, or who have responsibility for particular pieces of equipment. It's also helpful to let folks know where they can go for help if the VRI is not working properly, or if there are technical problems with some equipment. Who should they contact for help? Is there a help desk, or is there a particular staff member who has more expertise in that area who can step in quickly to get that addressed? And finally, it's important to have a process in place for patients and their companions to submit complaints or to raise concerns if there is a problem. And that can provide some useful feedback on what's working and what's not working so that the procedures can be adjusted if they need to be. The sample procedure also includes some additional resources. As I mentioned before, the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing has a communication access plan that can be very useful when doing that individualized assessment of need. We've also included an HHS example policy and procedure for providing auxiliary aids for persons with disabilities. And we've also included the CMS Improving Communication Access for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. And that includes some really helpful practical tips for how to communicate effectively in circumstances that might not be ideal if there is no interpreter available. And I think, so that covers what is included in the sample policy and procedure. And if your organization doesn't have a policy or procedure that addresses this, it's a good starting point. And if your organization does have a policy that addresses communication with people with sensory disabilities, it's an opportunity to go through and see if there are any areas that are missing or if there are things that can be updated to keep up with where technology is at this point. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any questions. I think we have a few minutes left.
Looks like you covered it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.